The sky had turned the color of iron, heavy with clouds that growled like an angry beast. Rain hammered the earth in endless sheets, carving rivulets through the soil and splashing against the whitewashed walls of the Whitmore estate. The mansion stood tall, its grand architecture a silent proclamation of power and wealth. Glass windows, polished to perfection, reflected flashes of lightning as if the heavens themselves bowed to its grandeur. 4 miles around, there was nothing as imposing as this house. To outsiders, it was a palace of dreams, where fortune resided, where ambition was rewarded, and where the struggles of ordinary life seemed nothing more than distant echoes. But on that particular night, the contrast between wealth and reality collided at the gates of this very estate. Beneath the sprawling oak tree near the driveway, an elderly couple huddled together. Their clothes clung to their frail bodies, soaked beyond recognition. The man's hands trembled as he tried to shield his wife from the storm, though his arms had long lost the strength of youth. The woman leaned against him, her breath shallow, her hair plastered across her wrinkled face. They were shadows of resilience, yet on the brink of collapse. At their side lay an old suitcase, its latch broken, its contents spilling into the mud. Photographs yellowed with time fluttered in the wind before sinking into puddles. Letters, edges curling, blurred under the relentless rain. A blanket, so thin it could barely ward off a summer chill, now sagged with water, useless against the cold. These were fragments of a life once filled with promise, now reduced to relics of survival. The mansion's golden lights glowed faintly through the storm, a cruel reminder that warmth and comfort were only steps away, yet impossibly out of reach. The couple did not cry out, for even their voices had been stolen by exhaustion. They clung only to each other as though their bond might defy the elements. Moments later, a sleek black sedan glided into the driveway, its tires sending sprays of water across the stone path. The door swung open and out stepped Alexander Whitmore, the master of the estate. His figure was immaculate as always, tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit that seemed untouched by life's harsher realities. The storm had painted chaos everywhere, yet his presence seemed to cut through it, commanding attention without effort. But as his polished shoes splashed against the driveway, his gaze fell upon the figures beneath the oak tree. He stopped. His body froze mid-step, the storm momentarily silenced in his mind. There, on the edge of his manicured lawn, were 2 human beings drenched, defeated, and nearly lifeless. For a man accustomed to control, this sight was a rupture. He had built his empire on iron will and calculated precision. He was used to stock markets and boardrooms, to deals that shaped industries. He was not used to chaos manifesting itself in such raw human form directly at his doorstep. His first instinct was disbelief. What were they doing here? Why here of all places? Then his eyes shifted to the suitcase. A photograph caught in the rain showed the same couple in their youth, smiling, vibrant, full of hope. The realization struck like thunder. These were not strangers shaped only by poverty. They were once dreamers, builders, lovers. People who had lived a life not so different from his own parents. The rain pressed harder, drumming against his shoulders, soaking through his tailored suit. Yet he did not move. A memory clawed its way from the depths of his mind, his mother's weary hands folding laundry after long hours, his father's body collapsing on a chair after endless shifts, the hollow ache of hunger in his own stomach as a child. He had buried those images under layers of success and ambition, convincing himself they were nothing but relics of another life. But now, staring at the couple, the past surged back with painful clarity. This could have been his family. This could have been him. The elderly man stirred weakly, lifting his head with visible effort. His eyes blinked against the rain, clouded with fatigue but still holding a trace of dignity. The woman's grip on his arm tightened as though afraid the storm might steal him away. Their silence spoke louder than any cry for help. It was the silence of those who had suffered too long, who had lost too much, who no longer had the strength to plead. Alexander's chest tightened. For all the empires he had built, for all the money in his accounts, he had never faced something so confronting, so undeniably human on his very doorstep. He had seen poverty in passing, glimpses from a car window, stories in the news. Always distant. Always someone else's problem. But tonight it was real. It was undeniable. And in that moment, Alexander Whitmore, the millionaire of unshakable resolve, felt his heart jolt with something he had almost forgotten: compassion. Yet compassion alone was not enough. He had a choice to make. He could turn his back, retreat into the comfort of his mansion, and convince himself it was not his burden to bear. Or he could act. Lightning split the sky. Thunder roared. And Alexander stepped forward, each stride heavy with a decision that would alter not only the lives of the couple before him but his own soul as well. As he drew near, the rain drenched him fully, soaking his pristine suit, dripping into his hair and plastering it across his forehead. But he no longer cared. He crouched beside the couple, his voice low but urgent. "Stay with me," he whispered, his hand reaching toward them. The man stirred faintly, confusion in his eyes. The woman's head lifted just enough to reveal lips trembling with the effort of a breath. Their hands, intertwined even in weakness, were slick with rain. Alexander motioned toward the mansion, shouting for his staff. Blankets. Hot drinks. Urgency rippled through his voice, through his posture, through the storm itself. The once silent driveway erupted into movement as servants rushed forward, guided not by command but by the sheer gravity of their master's change. The millionaire who had lived for ambition now stood in the rain, not as a man of power, but as a man confronted with truth. And that truth was simple. Wealth meant nothing if it could not lift those who had fallen. The storm did not relent. Thunder rumbled across the skies as if echoing the turmoil inside Alexander's chest. His staff hurried from the mansion, umbrellas straining against the wind, blankets clutched tightly to their sides, and steaming flasks of tea carried carefully so the rain would not dilute their contents. Yet Alexander hardly noticed the commotion. His gaze remained fixed on the couple before him, as though the rest of the world had faded into shadow. The man's name would come later. The woman's story would reveal itself in time. But in those first moments they were not names or tales. They were suffering embodied. Their breaths were shallow, their limbs trembling with weakness, their eyes flickering like candles nearing extinction. "Lift them gently," Alexander commanded, his voice sharp yet quivering beneath its usual composure. Two attendants moved forward, draping thick woolen blankets around the couple's shoulders. The woman coughed, the sound frail and wet, and Alexander felt a pang in his chest he could not explain. He reached forward instinctively, steadying her as if she were his own mother. The man tried to rise, legs buckling beneath him. Alexander's hand shot out, supporting his weight. Their eyes met, one pair filled with the dim remnants of strength, the other with an awakening long suppressed. Together they made their way into the mansion. Each step left muddy prints upon the polished marble floors, each droplet of rain falling from their bodies an intrusion into the sterile perfection of the Whitmore estate. But Alexander no longer cared about the sanctity of marble or rugs. Tonight, they were meaningless compared to the fragile lives he now sheltered beneath his roof. The drawing room blazed with firelight, crackling logs casting warmth and shadows upon the walls. The couple sank into armchairs positioned close to the hearth, steam rising faintly from their damp clothes as the heat began its slow work. Blankets wrapped them tightly. Cups of tea trembled in their hands, the liquid spilling slightly as their grip faltered. Alexander stood nearby, every detail of the scene etching itself into his mind. He had not invited guests like this before, strangers who bore nothing but the scars of hardship. His mansion had known royalty, business magnates, celebrities. But not this. Not two weary souls whose only wealth was each other. And it was precisely this difference that unsettled him. As the couple sipped their tea in silence, Alexander felt memories stir once more, unbidden but relentless. He remembered the nights his mother had wrapped him in a second-hand blanket because they could not afford heat. He remembered his father's cough, deep and rattling after endless shifts in the factory, a cough that never quite went away. He remembered hunger gnawing at his stomach, the shame of wearing patched shoes while others wore new. He had buried those memories, locking them away behind walls of achievement and money. Success had been his armor. But tonight, the sight of the frail hands clutching teacups tore those walls down brick by brick. The elderly woman spoke first. Her voice was a whisper, fragile as the flame of a candle. We walked for miles. Her words carried the weight of exhaustion, yet also the courage of someone who had endured beyond what should have been possible. Alexander leaned closer, catching every syllable as though it were a revelation. We had nowhere left, the man added, his voice hoarse. Our home gone. The word struck harder than the storm outside. Home. The foundation of human dignity. To be stripped of it was to be left not just without shelter but without belonging. Alexander drew in a sharp breath. He could not help but imagine his own parents. What if they had lost everything? What if their long years of sacrifice had ended not with him building an empire, but with them wandering roads with nothing but memories in a suitcase? The thought clawed at his chest, leaving him unsettled in a way no financial loss ever could. His butler approached quietly, murmuring about dry clothes, medical assistance, food. Alexander nodded, dismissing him with a wave. He wanted to hear more. He needed to hear more. The man's hand trembled as he set down his tea. We thought perhaps someone would help. His voice cracked on the last word as though hope itself were brittle. Alexander turned toward the fireplace, the flames dancing like accusations. How many times had he walked past suffering without a second glance? How many times had he comforted himself with the thought that it was not his problem, that his wealth excused him from involvement? Now those excuses lay shattered, drowned in the rain that had drenched this couple and drenched his conscience alike. He finally spoke, his voice low, almost confessional. Why here? Why my estate? The man's eyes lifted, clouded yet steady. We did not choose, sir. Our bodies they gave out. We collapsed. There was no accusation in his tone. No plea for pity. Only the bare truth of exhaustion. Alexander felt his throat tighten. They had not come to beg from him. They had not intended to confront him with their plight. Fate had placed them here on his lawn, as though demanding he face what he had long ignored. The storm outside began to soften, the rhythm of rain against the windows easing into a gentler patter. Yet inside the mansion, the storm within Alexander raged fiercer than ever. He studied them, really studied them, the lines etched into their faces, the weight of years carried in their hunched shoulders, the quiet endurance in their intertwined hands. And something within him shifted. For decades, his life had been measured in numbers. Stock prices, net worth, properties, influence. But looking at this couple, he realized none of those numbers mattered if they could not shield human beings from despair. His chest rose and fell as he turned away from the firelight, his footsteps echoing softly across the marble floor. He paused at the tall windows, watching the storm fade into mist. For the first time in years, he felt the echo of a question he had once asked as a boy. What is the value of a man if he forgets the struggles of others? He had silenced that question for too long. But tonight, the silence was broken. Behind him, the couple sat quietly, wrapped in blankets, clinging to fragile dignity. Before him stretched the empire of wealth he had built. Between the two lay a chasm. And Alexander knew, deep in his heart, that he could no longer stand still at the edge. The millionaire who had prided himself on iron will now face a choice that required more than willpower. It required humility. And perhaps compassion. The storm eased into a drizzle, but the storm inside Alexander Whitmore showed no sign of calming. He stood in the drawing room, the heat from the fireplace brushing against his back, his reflection faint in the tall windows that overlooked his rain-soaked estate. Behind him, the couple sat wrapped in thick blankets, sipping slowly at cups that steamed faintly in the warm air. Their frail bodies seemed smaller against the grandeur of his furniture, almost swallowed by the richness of the room. Yet they carried with them a gravity the polished gold frames and velvet curtains could never possess. He turned, finally facing them again. His voice, usually so precise, so commanding, carried a weight that surprised even him. What are your names? The woman lifted her tired eyes, her lips trembling before sound escaped. Martha, she whispered. She leaned gently into the man's arm as if borrowing his strength for this moment. The man straightened, though it took effort, his hand trembling slightly as he set his teacup aside. Henry. Alexander repeated their names under his breath. Martha. Henry. They were no longer strangers. They were human, flesh and bone, story and memory. The distance that had allowed him to observe them as the suffering was dissolving. Now they were people. As silence stretched, Henry's eyes fell to the floor, his voice breaking through again, rough like gravel. We had a home once. It was not much. A small cottage on the outskirts of town. But it was ours. Martha's hand slid over his, fingers curled with quiet affirmation. Until it wasn't. The words hung heavy in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of displacement, of dignity stripped away by forces indifferent to human struggle. Alexander lowered himself into the armchair opposite them. His presence, once so overwhelming, seemed smaller now, his posture less rigid, his hands no longer folded with arrogance but resting open, vulnerable, on his knees. He listened. Henry's story unfolded in fragments, his voice halting at times, Martha filling in the gaps when fatigue overcame him. They spoke of late bills, of illness, of children who had long since moved away and never looked back. They spoke of neighbors who once offered help but later closed their doors, too weighed down by their own survival to carry another burden. We thought we had planned enough for old age, Henry admitted, his voice cracking. But age comes faster than you think. Work slips from your fingers. The world forgets you. Alexander's chest tightened. He thought of his estranged brother, of words once thrown in anger over inheritance. He thought of the dinners missed, the family gatherings sacrificed for meetings, the birthdays lost to negotiations. He thought of how wealth had filled his calendar but emptied the spaces where love and care should have lived. Martha's voice trembled, though her gaze was steady. "We did not come here to shame anyone. We only needed somewhere to stop. To rest." Alexander drew in a slow breath. Shame, that was the word she had avoided speaking, yet it clawed at him anyway. Not because they placed it on him, but because his own heart carried it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the crackling of firewood, the slow ticking of the grandfather clock, the unspoken weight of realization settling deep into Alexander's bones. He finally broke it. "Stay here tonight. Both of you. My doctors will come at first light." Martha's lips parted, surprise flashing across her face, quickly followed by tears that welled up despite her effort to hold them back. Henry bowed his head, his fingers clutching the blanket tighter. "We could not," Henry began, but Alexander raised his hand. "You can. And you will." His voice, though firm, no longer carried the sharpness of command. Instead, it bore the quiet strength of conviction. Servants moved discreetly, preparing guest chambers, laying out dry clothes, arranging for hot meals. Alexander remained where he was, studying the faces across from him. He saw gratitude, yes, but also shame, the quiet shame of needing what others must provide. It gnawed at him, and he wondered how many others lived with the same silent burden while he had congratulated himself for his victories. Later that night, after Henry and Martha had been led to warm beds, Alexander lingered in the hallway. He stared at the closed door of their chamber, his mind refusing rest. He saw his mother in Martha's tired eyes, his father in Henry's weakened frame. He saw his own childhood stitched into their suffering, a reminder of where he had come from and how far he had strayed. He paced the corridor, the marble floor cold beneath his steps. The house was silent now, yet his heart thundered with questions. Had he mistaken ambition for purpose? Had he traded compassion for numbers? What was empire worth if the people who built it could still collapse in the rain? As he finally returned to his own wing of the mansion, Alexander caught his reflection in a gilded mirror. For the first time in decades, he did not see the millionaire, the titan of deals and influence. He saw a boy who once feared hunger, who once dreamed of safety, who once wished someone would notice. That boy had been silenced. But tonight the silence cracked. The next morning dawned bright, the storm having washed the skies into clarity. Birds sang as if mocking the heaviness in Alexander's chest. Yet when he stepped into the guest chamber, the sound of soft breathing met him. Henry and Martha slept peacefully, their faces calmer, their bodies wrapped in the comfort of clean sheets and warmth. Something stirred in him then. A realization, quiet but powerful. This was not charity. This was justice. Justice for lives too often ignored, for dignity too easily discarded. And for the first time in years, Alexander Whitmore felt the stirrings of peace. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm Alexander had never known inside his mansion. Doctors arrived to examine Henry and Martha, their kind eyes masking the gravity of frail pulses and weakened lungs. Meals were prepared with care, served not on gold-plated dishes for display but in steaming bowls meant to nourish. Fresh clothes were laid out, simple but warm, and blankets were folded over their knees as they sat by the window, watching the estate gardens glisten after the rain. Each evening Alexander visited them. At first, he stood in silence, an observer in his own house, unsettled by the emotions their presence stirred. But soon words came. He began to ask questions about their youth, about the cottage they once called home, about the children whose laughter once filled their walls. And they answered, sometimes with smiles, sometimes with tears, sometimes with pauses that spoke louder than speech. Martha's voice often carried a soft wisdom. "We had little," she told him one evening as the firelight played across her worn face, "but we had each other. And for many years that was enough." Henry's words were fewer but steady. "Life strips you down in layers," he said quietly. "You fight to keep what matters. And in the end only love stays." Alexander listened. Truly listened. And with each story he felt another piece of his hardened exterior fall away. He had spent years building walls around himself, walls of pride, ambition and self-reliance. But Henry and Martha's quiet dignity made those walls seem meaningless. At times he found himself remembering his own past, his father's weary shoulders, his mother's quiet resilience, his brother's laughter before bitterness had driven them apart. He remembered the ache of hunger, the cold of nights when heat was scarce, the sting of being overlooked. And he wondered, not for the first time, if his wealth had made him blind to the very struggles that had once defined him. One afternoon as he walked the estate gardens with Henry leaning on his arm for support, The older man paused, gazing up at the towering mansion. His eyes held no envy, only quiet reflection. "You've built something remarkable here," Henry said, his voice thin but steady. "But don't forget, the greatest homes are not made of stone and glass. They are made of people who belong to one another." The words struck deeper than any lecture or sermon Alexander had ever heard. They were not grand, but they carried truth forged by years of endurance. That night, as Alexander lay awake in his vast bedroom, he realized that his fortune, his empire, his estate, all of it meant nothing if it could not provide belonging. By the week's end, Henry and Martha had regained enough strength to move without constant assistance. Their eyes, once dulled by despair, now held a flicker of life again. Martha's smile returned, faint but genuine, and Henry's voice grew steadier as he spoke of days long past. It was then that Alexander made a decision. One morning he summoned them to a quiet part of the estate, a cottage nestled near the edge of the gardens. It was modest, far smaller than the mansion, but its walls were sturdy, its roof strong, its hearth ready to welcome warmth. The garden behind it carried the fragrance of roses, and a narrow path led to the woods where sunlight streamed gently through the trees. Martha gasped when she saw it, her hands trembling as they clasped together. Henry stood in silence, his eyes glistening. "This," Alexander said, placing a small set of keys into Henry's hand, "is yours. A place to call home again. Not charity, belonging. Safety. Dignity." Martha's voice broke as tears spilled down her cheeks. We do not know how to thank you." Henry's hand shook as he placed it on Alexander's shoulder, his eyes meeting the younger man's with a depth of gratitude words could never carry. Alexander swallowed hard, his own throat thick with emotion. "Then do not thank me. Live here. Fill this place with your presence. That will be thanks enough." The couple stepped into their new home, their steps unsteady but purposeful. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, they felt the grounding of belonging under their feet. Martha ran her hand across the windowsill, Henry touched the sturdy wooden frame, and both smiled through tears that cleansed more than the rain ever had. As Alexander turned back toward his mansion, sunlight streamed through the clouds, bathing the estate in golden light. The storm that had once drenched them all seemed like a distant memory, a trial washed clean by compassion. And in that moment, Alexander understood what no fortune had ever taught him. True wealth was not measured in accounts or assets. It was measured in the lives one touched, the dignity one restored, the belonging one provided. The millionaire who once prided himself on ambition now walked with a new burden, but it was not heavy. It was the burden of compassion, of responsibility, of remembering that he too had once been close to the edge. And though his mansion still stood tall, Alexander knew that the greatest structure he had built that week was not of stone, but of love.